Hey, Ben Pearson, the Roadster Tracker. With Starman's recent close flyby of the planet Mars, we start to think about some of the other cars in space, and I've got a really important question for you. Could we steal any of these other cars in space? Well, first of all, let's talk about what these cars actually are. There are 3 lunar rovers, in addition to Elon Musk's Tesla Roadster, that are hanging out there in space that have had humans actually ride in them. These 3 missions were sent as the later Apollo missions, Apollos 15, 16, and 17, to the surface of the moon, and they're just sitting out there, available for anybody who could theoretically get to the moon and go for a joyride. Or would that really work? Well, first of all, would this actually qualify as stealing? The short answer is yes. NASA has set a set of guidelines in order to protect the Apollo missions and also some of the earlier missions like Surveyor and so on and so forth. Their guidelines are very specific. They have basically 3 different regions of interest. The first one is when you're flying overhead, and they very specifically say, do not fly directly over the sites. You have to have at least 2 kilometers distance. That is thought to be enough distance where you would be relatively safe if you were to accidentally, say, crash, as the one private lander we've had sent there, the Beresheet lander, crashed. Hopefully that would all work. And the whole goal is to not be in that zone at any point in time, including if a failure. You kind of want to have a tangent line to this exclusion zone so that you're trying to land right at the very edge. Well, once you've landed, you could send a rover to go get a little bit closer. They have a second zone that depends on the mission, but it's anywhere from 250 meters to 750 meters around the lander site itself that is protected. The center of each one of these is the descent stages, because that makes the most natural center, but all of the artifacts in there are protected as well. With special permission, you could visit each one of the Apollo sites, except for 11 and 17, which are considered especially significant, and we don't want to be touching those at all. Those particular sites you could visit with this rover. You could get fairly close to some of the artifacts there. You're not allowed to touch any of them, and they have specific exclusion zones around them depending on the artifact. Most of the artifacts are a 1 meter exclusion zone. It's close enough, you could go check it out and do some pretty cool stuff. You also have to be outside of the artifact zone during the lunar night because you don't want to have a spacecraft get stuck in there. And so they have these layers of protection so that we could theoretically go and visit them, but you're not going to do anything too close to there. The answer for Apollo 11 and 17 is you could have a flight that is hanging just outside of this air exclusion zone to not go under. It's going up there, take some camera pictures, you could get a pretty good view of it, but they don't want to be anywhere closer so that way we're not disturbing it because these are very, very historic sites. They wanted to have one of the J-class Apollo missions, which are the ones with the lunar rovers protected, and they figured that Apollo 17 was the most natural. Obviously, Apollo 11 being the first to land down there is also considered extremely significant. So, yes, it would very much be considered stealing. And if you were to even launch a spacecraft to go to the moon, you'd have to follow a set of guidelines. It's very, very likely that no matter where you launched it from any country that's capable of launching, except for maybe North Korea, you wouldn't be able to if they had any inkling that you were going to do this. But let's say that theoretically you were able to somehow sneak away from these regulations and to be able to launch something there. Would it actually do you any good? Now, I've previously talked about the state of Elon Musk's Tesla Roadster. It's only been in there for a few years at this point in time, and it's probably still pretty beat up. Of course, the Roadster was modified pretty heavily before launching. It's pretty obvious that it wouldn't really be drivable. It only had 1 wheel, for instance, that launched, the 1 wheel that we saw in the video. But the lunar rovers were actually made to drive around on the surface of the moon. Would those actually work right now? Well, short answer, no. No, they wouldn't work at all. Longer answer, the batteries are completely toast. They're battery powered, as that was really the best source for a short duration mission like this. The batteries, like any battery that would be left out for an extended period of time, would be completely shorted. You'd have to completely, totally replace that. Well, once you replace the battery, you still have some other issues. There are two issues of significance that you have to deal with. One is called cold fusion. When you're in space, especially, and this happens to a lesser extent on Earth, if you have something that's meant to move but be in close proximity to some other piece of metal, and they are stuck for a long period of time, then they kind of fuse a little bit together. If you've ever had a door that hasn't been opened in a long time, and then you finally open it, you have to kind of force it open that very first time. Once you've managed to do that, it's probably a lot easier to do that because they're no longer fused together. Well, this happens even stronger in a vacuum. When you have a vacuum, you don't have even air separating those two things. So essentially, you can kind of fuse things together. This can be deliberately done in friction stir welding, which is basically the same kind of concept, but much more deliberately done to form a very, very nice, secure bond. It can cause all kinds of problems, and this is something that anyone who designs a satellite has to be aware of. You have to make sure that these mechanical joints, if they're ever going to move, you have to move them periodically, or at least make sure that they're lubricated properly. This particularly matters for reaction wheels, that they're often left inside a sealed container that still has atmosphere, so that way they don't ever get stuck down to nothing so that they won't move. That would obviously be really bad. Well, the lunar rovers were not meant for a long duration mission, so they are no doubt subject to that, and the axle would probably have to be replaced as well as the motor. But there's also another problem. You see, the moon has very, very extreme cycles. The night-day cycle that happens every roughly 29 days on the moon is very extreme. This will cause different expansions and contractions of the metal, being very, very hard. Now, if everything was made out of exactly the same metal, this probably wouldn't have a major effect because everything would expand and contract at the same size. It may, depending on the ground, you could see some kind of movement, but it probably wouldn't be a major thing. But there were a number of different metals that went into it. These metals will expand and contract at different rates, and they'll slowly cause bending and cracking over time. Since the Apollo missions have landed, there has been over 600 thermal cycles, and that's going to be brutal on anything. You want to keep things about the same temperature if you can, but obviously that's not possible. They didn't design it for that. So that's going to cause anything that is metallic to have issues. The tires are probably the single most likely candidate to be severely damaged as a result of that. These expansion-contraction cycles will probably tear them apart, so you'd have to replace the tires and the axle and the motor and the batteries. You start to ask yourself after a little while, what's really left? And the seats are left, and maybe the frame, although the frame probably isn't in great condition. The bottom line is there's probably not any reason to go joyriding in the Lunar Rover. It'd take far, far more work. You're better off just bringing your own vehicle. Another thing to be very aware of is the lunar surface is not perfectly still. It is a vacuum, and when you're in deep space like the Tesla Roadster is, it's not very likely that you're going to impact anything, but being on the surface of the moon does have some dust. We've seen little dust storms that have come around the planet through the ages. They're thin, but over time, you're going to have things that have been bombarded. We saw a little bit of this with the Apollo 12 mission that visited one of the Surveyor missions, I think Surveyor 3, and you could see some little damage that had happened to the Surveyor spacecraft as a result of this. But it turns out that over the extended period of time, you're likely to have things covered by dust. It's actually hard to make out the lunar rovers themselves from the pictures. We don't have absolutely fantastic pictures. You can easily see the shadow where they were, but seeing the actual material is much, much harder. This tells me that they're probably covered in at least a thin layer of lunar dust, although it could be hard to say. There will be a little bit of oxidation. There is a tiny, tiny atmosphere on the moon. It's not enough to really do anything useful, but some of the stuff could rust over the time period that's happened. It's been 50 years. Even a thin atmosphere can cause some interesting issues. And it's probably not that bad, but it is something to at least be aware of. The bottom line, though, they're probably in pretty nice physical looking shape, but if you started looking at it, the tires are probably going to have some issues. You'd have to basically replace everything. So except for the sentimental value and the thinking of, hey, I'm still in a Lunar Rover, it's probably not something you really should be thinking about. Thank you guys so much for your support, for liking, subscribing, for my Patreons who help to fund these videos and upgrades, for my Discordians who help to do some of the research for these. You guys are amazing. I couldn't do all of this without you guys. Until next time, keep on tracking. Take care.